All right, welcome to the Stoa. My name is Arran Rogerson. I am here with Alyssa Polizzi, and today is the second session in the Shadow Sensemaking series. Today's topic is working with the shadow. So just to start, why don't you write in the chat what comes to mind when you think of shadow work? Are you familiar with the concept? Do you have some idea already of what shadow work is? Is it something completely new? Scary metal guy in my earliest childhood dreams. Yes, we will get into that today. Looking at repressed parts of myself, expressing vulnerability, working with the multi-dimensional unknown. That's good. Disowned sides of self. Good. Okay, so people seem pretty familiar with the concept already. Okay, so quick review.
So last week we covered the different dimensions of the shadow. So starting with the personal layer, the me that I cannot see. These are the aspects of ourself that we have ignored or denied, things that we've repressed, fears, weaknesses, potentials, the ugly sides of life, the aspects of ourself that we can't hold in our identity, that we choose not to own, yet are still a part of our conscious totality.
There's also a relational shadow in the sense that relationships have an unknown side or an undesirable side. So there might be things between you and your friends or your partners or your children that you deny, that you repress, that you ignore. There might be qualities of your friends that you don't like. And so you don't like them when they're behaving a certain way, and you like them when they're behaving another way. And so there's like a shadow that can develop inside relationships. The collective shadow is scaling up. So an idea that you have a personal shadow, there's also relation shadows, but there's also a collective shadow, maybe at a group level, at a community level, at a societal level. And that might be any undesirable parts of a system or unknown parts of a system. That might be complicated, difficult, or repressed things about society. That might be other tribes in the society that you think don't belong. Maybe that's the homeless or poor people, things that are not integrated into the system. So the metaphysics of the shadow, this is abstract, but anything that is a part of a system but not integrated into that system, or festering energy that's accumulated from an interrupted process. So an important concept, if we're thinking about shadow work, just breaking it down, there's this notion of purging versus integration. So a lot of shadow contents, whether that's personal or relational or collective, it's something that we feel does not belong, or something that we don't think is part of the self, or maybe that we don't think is part of the system. For instance, not part of society. Maybe we think that poor people don't belong in society. We should just kind of sweep them under the rug or something like that. So often our instinct with shadow contents, this thing doesn't belong, is to purge it, right? To just either throw it away or destroy it. Say, this part of myself, it's not me. It does not belong. It should just be destroyed or completely denied. But that doesn't work, right? So when we attempt to purge something that is part of us, we cause further injury and fragmentation. Just like my arm is a part of me, right? And if I, for some reason, thought my arm wasn't me, I might try to get rid of it somehow, like rip it off or scrape at it or try to hide it or something. And that wouldn't work, right? That would just make things worse. So when we try to purge the shadow, we exacerbate it and we give it even greater power over us because it gets pushed further and further into darkness where we can't engage with it. So instead of purging, what you have to do is integrate it. And that means you need to rehabilitate this wounded part, or you need to reclaim that thing that is lost, that thing that isn't part of the system needs to be brought back into the fold somehow, sort of recruited back into functional organization, you might say, of the system. So that's what integration is. You don't exterminate it, you kind of bring it back into functioning, having some kind of functioning energy, right? So all forms of shadow work are an attempt to integrate rather than purge.
So like last week, we're going to kind of walk through these different levels of working with the shadow. So starting at that personal layer, these aspects of ourselves that we want to purge often take the form of these undesirable aspects of self, which could be painful, difficult, embarrassing memories, experiences that were overwhelming, behavioral traits, physical aspects, the sort of like denial of one's face or body in this overwhelming way in which we push it away, we want to repress it, we want to purge it from ourselves, and there may be a desire to want to change these aspects in such a radical way that we no longer really look like ourselves. And that's moving further and further away from this process of taking ownership and integration. So to begin walking towards that path is to rehabilitate and kind of heal those wounds, to reclaim those lost parts of self, to accept all of the ugly parts of life that really make up the complexity and the nuance of who we are. And this can really range from really powerful, rational, conscious exploration to somatic work. Trauma also is a really big part of the personal shadow, as these experiences that we have on an individual level can be extremely overwhelming. And there is a natural way that our both psychology and physiology works with overwhelming stress. And there might be a need to sort of split these parts off to dissociate from them. But at a certain point, there has to be a kind of reconciliation. So abusive situations, neglect, accidents, all these things that are overwhelming in the moment might be pushed more deeply into the shadow, but eventually need to be touched back on again. Because when they aren't, they often manifest as greater issues, stress, depression, somatic issues, things like that.
So part of the point we're making is that this purge integrate pattern is going to appear at the relational level and at the collective level. And same with trauma. We have personal trauma. We're kind of familiar with that idea of something that has failed to integrate, but you're going to see that that's also happens in relationships. It happens in societies. Societies have trauma, things they cannot integrate. Okay, so again, more audience participation. Go ahead and write in the chat what you think of when you think of externalization, right? So this is kind of like the most basic concept of shadow work. What does it mean to externalize? What does it mean to? There's some examples listed, but what do you think of? Projection, acting out, yeah. Triple projection. Yeah, so externalization, one way of thinking about it is the way that we kind of project things onto the outside world. Reality, in one sense, is kind of a physical collection of things, but in another sense, it's a projection. So all of reality is kind of a mirror to what's inside. We're taking what's inside and we're putting it outside. And that's true for everything that you encounter in reality. Even objects are in some sense a projection. That's kind of abstract. But as far as shadow work goes, one way that we can work with the shadow is to externalize it intentionally, right? And we do this, we can take the shadow and turn it into an object that can now be engaged with. It can be observed objectively instead of just having this kind of subjective experience with the shadow where you can't really see it very well. So basic example, some of you maybe have listened to a voicemail that you sent someone and you've heard your own voice maybe for the first time. And you're like, whoa, is that me? Is that what I sound like? Like I sound like an idiot, or I sound weird, or you hear your own voice and you hear your own voice when you talk, but when it's externalized, suddenly you can kind of like look at it for what it is and like you can engage with it and you say, that's strange. Same with watching a video of yourself. If you've never been filmed much and you see yourself on video for the first time, the response is often like, that's what I look like. That's my energy. Like, that's very strange. So we can do this intentionally to kind of make sense for ourselves. When we vent, if we're talking to someone, we're just venting how we're feeling. Like, all these things are bothering me. This is what's going on in my life. This is how I'm struggling. You actually find that that's very helpful, right? The process is helpful, just kind of externalizing, but also once you've externalized it out, you can actually interact with it and say, wow, I sound like I'm really depressed and I didn't realize it. What does that mean? Confession, if you go to like a Catholic church, there's like confession. Part of that is a process of shadow work, of taking this thing that's burdening you inside, that's sort of festering inside of you, this secret, and you like let it come out. And that process is actually really therapeutic and really helpful. And you can kind of process shadow just by speaking it. It's good to like talk to people and say, hey, Alyssa, what do you think my shadow is? What are these things I'm not paying attention to, or these things I'm ignoring? That's useful. That can be very difficult, but it's actually like a very therapeutic thing to do. So these are like very basic things. Peter, of course, journals every day. I think his journaling is a form of shadow work. I think that he is processing things. It's very therapeutic. He's confronting things, because once you read something on paper, it's not just in the mind anymore. It's out there and you can engage with it. And you can look back a year ago and be like, I wrote about this. That's some good perspective. So this image maybe is Peter in like 30 years, 20 years. I don't know. Anyway, so a good example of a shadow work process that's kind of like classic, that is kind of tested. And this is like the 3-2-1 process. And the way the 3-2-1 process works is that the theory is that self-banishing, the way that we produce shadow, is we go from a first-person ownership to a second person, which is projection. We're projecting onto people. So we go from saying, I am a bad person, to going, you are a bad person. And then maybe we further disown it, and it goes to like a third-person place where it's just sort of this strange entity that we don't really understand, of like badness in our lives. So the idea is to kind of reverse that process, right? So you're going to walk the opposite way. You're going to go from third person. You're going to take a difficult person or an image, or even just a body sensation, some kind of shadow content, anything that creates a disturbance in your life or in your awareness. You're going to take that and you're going to describe it in the third person. You're going to say, it is. And then you're going to go to second person and say, you are. And so you're like having a dialogue with the shadow contents, this sort of badness or disowned part of yourself. You're actually talking to it and say, what do you want? Where did you come from? What do you need from me? What kind of gift do you want to bring me? So you're having a dialogue with your shadow. And then it goes to first person, where you actually try to take ownership over it. And you say, I am this shadow content. I am weak. I am this annoying, nagging person. I am this group of people I dislike. So that's one example of playing with externalization. You can kind of breathe in and out. You can go from 1 to 2 to 3, 3 to 2 to 1, 1 to 2 to 3, and play with this kind of externalization process.
So we're moving through these different layers of experience. And if externalization represented more of that logical, rational sort of thinking function, we take a step lower and we start to apply shadow work to the imaginal realm. So quick audience participation, we'd love to hear what you think of when the word imaginal comes to mind. Any thoughts, any particular activities, narratives? Art, yeah. Listening to music, daydreaming. Yeah, these are great examples. Yeah. The right kind of drugs. That's definitely true. That'll blast you right into the imaginal realm. So the shadow can be engaged in the imaginal space, which is really about the archetypal dimension of the psyche, kind of moving below ego, moving below conscious awareness, and connecting to those deep parts of the psyche through symbolism and mythopoetic imagery. So a couple of examples of how we can start to work with the shadow, dreams. Dream work is really powerful if you track it on a daily basis or pretty regularly enough and start to apply a symbolic view towards the images, the people, the themes that come forward, and start to consider what it is that the dream might be compensating for, what is it showing as development in the psyche. Dreams may seem sort of ridiculous and over the top, but look at it like a myth or look at it like a fairy tale, and you start to see that there's this depth of insight to what your dreams are showing you. Similarly, active imagination, a very popular Jungian tool, but that we see also in lots of other spiritual traditions, is a way of interacting with that kind of imaginal dream realm, but in a waking state. So it's kind of like conscious meditative technique that you can apply to like drawing or painting or dancing or visual meditation, where you engage with this inner imagery. Divination is another one. Tarot, the I Ching, runes, all these types of systems that are very complex, symbolically built, and inherently draw out archetypal patterns and narratives so that you can explore something in the tarot, such as, what am I not seeing in this situation? Draw a card at random. What comes up? What does the theme speak to? Because we're not consciously choosing what card we want to answer our question, we allow these kind of emergent patterns to come forward, and we have to sort of parse out through the symbolic language what it's speaking to. And that really helps kind of break the conscious frame, the way that you always look at a situation, or the way that you always handle things. When you kind of tap into more of that symbolic realm, you allow a sense of spontaneity and a kind of synchronicity to draw something up from that unconscious space. Narrative alchemy slash self-mythologizing. This is something that we tap into with Golden Shadow, or if you've been to shadow play events with Arran and I, this way of creating these archetypal containers of the parts of our shadow and kind of morphing them into archetypal characters so that you can narrate and work with these parts of yourself, kind of utilizing some of those principles of externalization, but at the same time, seeing what comes forward. Like maybe your shadow takes on the form of a knight with, broken armor and who is wounded. And what does that mean symbolically? You can think about the archetype of the warrior, but also the wounded aspects. Lastly, we have mythology and story as forms of self-reflection. And this is actually looking into myths and fairy tales and recognizing that these act as a sort of like collective therapeutic socializing tool, that when we write these stories and they've carried over time, that they carry these really strong patterns of kind of psychological truth in them. So you can utilize the labors of Hercules and walk through them and see how you might be playing out, the fight against the Nemean lion, or slaying the Hydra, and using that as ways to access your own inner content through that mythological sphere. So the highlight for the imaginal is active imagination. So this process is where we allow these unconscious aspects of the psyche to come forward, and we engage with it in a active present state. So it's very similar to dreaming, except instead of actually being asleep, you are engaging with this imagery. So there's this tension between what's coming up in a spontaneous way and how you can actually interact with it. So usually this process works by beginning to anchor or select some sort of imagery or environment to begin with. So maybe you had a dream about a burning house. So you can hold that in your mind, sit in a type of meditative state, take deep breaths, center yourself, and conjure up that image in your mind. And the way that you can kind of start to work with it is to allow whatever comes up to express itself. And if things start to shift and move, follow it, see where it goes. So you might sort of see in your mind the house burning. And there might be a sense consciously of wanting to put out that fire. And as you kind of walk towards the house, maybe some sort of figure starts to walk in front of you and says, let it burn. And there's a feeling of, well, I didn't really consciously choose to conjure up this other character, but allow it to express itself, speak to the character, dialogue with it. Why does it want the house to burn? And after you go through this process and kind of complete a natural turn of this meditation, then there's this opportunity for integration and assimilation. You know, you can look at the content of the active imagination symbolically, like you would a dream. And often houses are a typical dream symbol of like the structures of the psyche where we're at. And fire is very much sort of destructive, but also transformational. So what aspect of yourself might be in flux and transformation and change? And what part of you might desire to kind of put that change and that fire out? But at the same time, there's another part that's inviting you to kind of let that fall, let it burn down to the ground so something new can be built. So active imagination really taps into the imaginal, archetypal, and narrative space and can be extremely powerful for shadow work. So the next layer, going a little bit deeper, is into the body. We have to recognize that much of our shadow is locked inside the physical body, and we can't talk our way out of integrating shadow or integrating trauma, but rather there are these embodied aspects that are often sometimes even like the biggest hurdles that we have to jump over in our shadow work. So the engaging and deepening of body awareness and acknowledging certain physiological processes that may have been disrupted during the sort of creation of shadow is kind of like the lowest, sort of deepest, most rooted, grounded form, but might also be some of the most difficult parts. So I feel like some of the entrance points into embodied shadow work is just beginning with breath work, yoga, meditation, anything that helps you really drop into the body and become aware or start to control the sort of physiological processes that are moving. The controlling of breath actually is something that we don't think about very often, but if we practice it on a daily basis, we recognize that there are ways that we can calm, you know, the agitation in our body. And then we can move on to practices like focusing, where the felt sense comes from, the ability to kind of tap into the body wisdom rather than sort of consciously putting words to our experience. We just drop into the felt sense of the tension in our chest or the heat in our hands that allows us to become aware that our body is affected by the thoughts going through our mind, our emotions that we're feeling. And that takes us further into therapeutic modalities and interventions that are specifically looking to work with trauma and shadow in an embodied way. So somatic experiencing is looking at the treatment of trauma through which aspects of the somatic process may have been disrupted. EMDR is another one, which allows you to kind of tap back into shadowy traumatic memories and engage both the body and brain through eye movement or having your hands or shoulders tapped. Internal family systems, parts work, really, I think, isn't in its fullest expression unless you recognize where parts are felt in the body. So that's a big part of working with identifying any sort of part of our psyche that might be damaged or traumatized or in shadow, is recognizing that it might cause tension in the shoulders. And last but not least, Gestalt therapy. I think the kind of 2-chair exercise is a really nice example of how when we start to embody and move through processes, we might actually work through more shadow. So in this case, an individual is asked to move between different chairs as they embody different parts of themselves. And this kind of action of getting up and moving and feeling yourself kind of shifting these different levels helps you tap into more aspects in the body as well as in the mind. So our highlight for the somatic realm is pendulation, and this is from the somatic experiencing field. And this is really, really predicated on the aspect of the body that seems to move through these processes of expansion and contraction. And when trauma is formed, it's often that some sort of physiological process has been blocked. So we might get stuck in this element of contraction when our body needs to be able to fully move and process through. So pendulation really invites in a gentle way for us to interact with embodied shadow. So you start out by focusing your awareness on any type of difficult feeling present, like maybe some aspect of shadows come forward. You're starting to feel, you know, panicky, the sense of anxiety, your breath getting more and more out of beat. And as you notice those sensations, you kind of drop into the felt sense. Pendulation asks you then to find another part of your body or your experience that represents neutrality or calm or peacefulness. So you start to kind of move in between senses of tension and stress back to a place of peace or wholeness or lightness. And that can take the form of an actual part of your body, like maybe my feet feel okay, my feet feel light, but the rest of the tension's in my chest. So you start to kind of move your awareness from chest to feet and chest to feet. But this also can be used like through imagery. Like maybe what comes to mind is the picture of a bird flying. So you move from tension in your chest to an image of the bird, and then back and forth and back and forth. And you just sort of pendulate between these two. And what we're trying to do is facilitate a more natural expression of our physiological processes of stress, of how the automatic nervous system actually should regulate itself. Because when we deal with shadow, when trauma has developed in the body, it's often that these processes have been blocked or disrupted in some way. So naming your experience, speaking it out loud, moving through that pendulation, and then coming out of it and really sitting with it, maybe journaling about it, so that you've both kind of felt it in that deep somatic sense, but you can also kind of concretize it through word, through journaling.
So just briefly touching upon the concept of the relational shadow and working with the relational shadow. And as you scale up to multiple individuals, things kind of get a little more vague and it's harder to pinpoint how to really work on the relational shadow. But we get back to this kind of purge and integrate pattern, right? So all relationships have things about them that are sort of undesirable. It would be nice if my romantic partner didn't do this. Or it would be nice if my child behaved differently. And so an instinctual way to deal with things that we don't think belong or that we don't want in our lives is to try and purge them, right? So if your child is crying, for instance, you might yell at them like, stop crying. And when you're doing that, you're kind of just like trying to purge it, right? You're trying to like kind of just get rid of that. And the child might learn that like, okay, they can't actually express their emotions. They can't show any weakness. They can't show any vulnerability around you. And that might be traumatic for them. And so this purging of this kind of relational shadow of like your child's annoying and you want to purge that doesn't work very well, right? And it makes things worse. It makes your relationship with your child worse. It creates a relational shadow that's bigger and bigger because now the child doesn't want to talk to you anymore or doesn't want to express itself in front of you. So you can't purge, right? You have to integrate. And so what does that mean for a relational shadow? How do you integrate a relational shadow? And you can, of course, do personal shadow work, like the examples we just gave. You can do that in tandem with someone else. That works. And there's all kinds of ideas maybe that you can come up with, like, circling, I think, is sort of an interesting practice that could involve some kind of shadow work of some kind. And we might get into that in the next session. But integrating a relational shadow it means you have to rehabilitate broken parts of a relationship. If something between you is wounded, that needs to be healed somehow. It needs to be rehabilitated. There needs to be acceptance of faults and mistakes. Often a relational shadow has to do with shame, where someone is feeling too ashamed to reveal themselves, or they feel like they've fucked up in some way and they can't really be who they're meant to be with you. Communication of needs and concerns, like bringing things to light so they can actually be confronted and engaged with, right? Externalization, but like mutual externalization. Mediation, conflict resolution. Couples therapy obviously is kind of like a form of shadow work where it's like there's some great shadow that is ruining our relationship. We need someone to come in and help us integrate it somehow. And just illustrating the kind of trauma idea again. So if trauma is an event that has failed to integrate, and let's say there's a relational trauma, maybe that's like a breach of trust. Let's say my friend lied to me, and that doesn't sit well with me. Like the fact that they would lie to me about something is kind of traumatic because now it's like I don't feel like I can trust them. This shadow emerges in the relationship, and if the trust is broken so badly, it might not be able to be integrated, right? Like you might just not be able to regain that trust at all. And that's kind of like trauma. It won't integrate. Infidelity, if your partner cheats on you, that often can just be like traumatic to the relationship, where it's like, this is not integratable. You cannot take this and integrate it. It's like, this is just some injury to the relationship. And it's really hard to process that, right? If you have, you know, a mutual friend dies, that might be so painful. You and your friend have a mutual friend that has died. That might be so painful that it creates a shadow that you can't process, that you can't integrate. Maybe you have a child that dies, and that tragedy just creates a shadow between you and your spouse. That can be traumatic. It can be something that cannot be integrated. So if we move on to the collective shadow, again, more question marks here. It's kind of vague. How do we do this? How do we integrate the collective shadow? It's very complicated. I don't know, but collectives have shadow, groups have shadow, communities have shadow, societies have shadow, and it's any undesirable parts of a system, right? So the homeless, I think, is a good example of people that are part of a system, but they're not integrated into the system. They're not part of the functional sort of organization of the system. That can sound kind of cold and calculating, but I think it's true. And so for the homeless, you know, we might just say, well, can't we just like get rid of them? Like, can't we just like catapult them into the ocean or something? Like, you know, it's like no one says that, but they're like kind of thinking it. And it's true for the poor. Maybe we should get rid of the poor. People also say maybe we should get rid of the rich. Other tribes. I don't like this other tribe. They don't belong. Can't we just purge them? Can't we just, you know, commit genocide and just exterminate all these people that we don't want? Like, you know, this happens and has happened throughout history. So those are good examples of collective shadow that needs to be integrated somehow. And what does that mean? And one way to integrate collective shadow is for sure to have open channels of communication, right? If disparate parts of a system can actually talk, that's integrating shadow. Stuff that's unknown, stuff that's mysterious, stuff that's unsaid or unspoken. If you can actually bring it into the light, you can integrate it. Rehabilitation of those who are displaced by the system. Again, if someone has been economically wrecked for some reason, you might just say, well, just get rid of them because they're too messy. But it's better if we can kind of rehabilitate people, right? To kind of find a way to sort of bring them back into the fold of society. Same with like convicts, I think, is a good example of societal shadow. We just want to throw them all in prison and just not deal with them. And does that work? It's not clear that works very well. It's not clear that actually is efficient even. It might just like exacerbate the collective shadow. So how do we rehabilitate convicts, for instance, would be a form of shadow work. Anyway, so these are just all like thoughts, illustrations of this concept. And collective trauma, slavery is a good example in America, right? This is like a series of events. It's not just a series of events, it's a pretty complicated thing, but like slavery is a trauma in our culture that we cannot integrate for some reason. We cannot figure it out. This thing is just like, it's festering and festering and festering. We can't integrate it. We can't make sense of what happened. We can't make sense of how to sort of rehabilitate this thing. So it's kind of like this festering shadow that we don't know how to deal with. That's true about war. It's true about genocide, massacres, stuff like that. So societies can have trauma, groups can experience trauma, and there needs to be some, you know, innovation in collective shadow work for us to sort of grow and heal as a collective of people.
So to round out the exploration, we must consider the limitations of shadow work and the dangers. Things are repressed for a reason. And I brought this up a little bit earlier in the presentation, but there is a very adaptive quality to our psyche where we will put certain things away into the shadow, into the unconscious, because it's just too overwhelming. So when it comes sort of time to begin opening that door and bringing things out of the dark, it's something that can be extremely overwhelming, destabilizing. It's something that I feel needs to be done with a lot of caution, because the integration of shadow does not happen quickly or overnight, and really sort of reveals itself in layers. And when we can hold the complexity of some aspect of shadow, we can go a little bit deeper into it. And that's what helps us keep our grounding. That's what helps us feel like we can hold the intensity of the shadow material, which is often very painful, very difficult, and allow that to really integrate rather than it continuing to be just re-traumatizing and re-traumatizing. Ways that shadow work can backfire at times might also come in the form of, individuals trying to work at shadow, or maybe even you trying to work through shadow. And that confrontation with others can make people isolate from you. Everyone might want to just keep their heads buried in the sand, or you may no longer fit into the puzzle that you once did. The boundaries of your relationships start to change as you integrate these aspects. So there can be relational consequences to that. That's why the kind of dialectic between two individuals is so important. Shadow work done in a vacuum isn't, I don't know, it isn't very realistic, I suppose, because we are so interconnected as a community relationally, and bringing other people into the fold is extremely powerful and necessary. So the incremental integration, slow and steady, having a support structure, keeping it contained in the well-sealed vessel of the relationship can allow us to really blossom through shadow work rather than be overwhelmed and just pulled into the depths.
Yeah, so just to illustrate this concept, because it's important to understand it, and it's kind of it's universal for all kinds of shadow work, that there's a way that what you think is intuitive for integrating the shadow is actually going to make things worse, right? And that's just a really important point to understand. One of the most obvious illustrations is psychedelics. It's like all your shadow content can just come up at once, and it just shatters your psyche basically, and you cause further trauma somehow. So you make the shadow worse by bringing it all into light at once. But as Alyssa was saying, a good illustration is in relationships. It's like you think that it's a good idea to confront someone, to talk it out about something that you've had a conflict about, right? It's like there's a shadow between us. I'm gonna walk up to you and I'm just gonna confront you, and let's integrate that shadow right now. Let's talk about it. And if you try that, sometimes it works, but often people just they get alienated from you, and you actually make the shadow worse and worse and worse the more you push on it in this way. And that's why it's such a dance, right? There's such a balance that needs to be struck with shadow work of how do you do it in a way that actually is incremental, and it's piece by piece, sort of gradually working with it and sort of processing it over time. What's too much shadow work? What's too little shadow work? There's some balance to be struck, and that can be very confusing. And it really depends on the individual and on the relationship, for instance, of what that means and how intense to go about it. So it's just important to keep that in mind, that it's the idea that oh, shadow work is just you should just do it as hard as you can, is not true. You got to be careful. So that's it for our presentation for today. So next week is going to be the final week, our third session in this series. The third session is going to be aspiring to shadow sensemaking. And you might ask, what is shadow sensemaking? And the answer is we don't know. And that's the point. We want to figure it out with you. So hopefully we get a good turnout next week, and we kind of want to present some ideas and talk about these online spaces, for instance, communities that are sort of exploring wisdom, and what shadow work means in those communities, and what's possible on the internet. For instance, in a space like the Stoa, is shadow work possible online? It might not be. We're not embodied on the internet. It's very easy to hide your shadow on the internet. All you can see is my face and hear my voice. You have no idea what's going on in my life. You can't even see if I'm wearing pants or not. So it's a question, can shadow work be done on the internet? We don't know. So anyways, next week is going to be an exploration of that. We're going to workshop it. We're going to kind of play around with the ideas and see what we can come up with. So it should be fun. And now we'll move on to Q&A. I think we've only gotten one question so far. Is that right? I haven't been keeping track.
Sam dropped a question into the chat. So if you could unmute yourself, Sam, and also would love, even if you could give a little bit more details of the aspect of an archetypal shadow that you're considering in this question.
Yeah, teach us, Sam.
In some ways, this is a hard question because the archetypal shadow and then concrete manifestations of the shadow. So I think I just want to just maybe say generally, the shadow in principle. To what extent do you imagine that the work of integrating the shadow brings it into a process where it can be recognized and then like sublimated or really successfully expressed in ways that even from the standpoint of the ego will be less unsavory than they had been when they were repressed, versus the shadow sort of being this ineradicably problematic element that to an extent we just have to come to terms with in the world and in reality, almost on a metaphysical level. It's a hard question. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
There's some interesting layers. I think partially like the nature of like the archetypal framework is that there is that the kind of dual polarity, the kind of valence in which the archetype can swing between. So you have these more like positive, light, affirming aspects of the archetype, and then you have these like shadowy parts. And we might think that tapping into some aspect of a shadow archetypal framework is negative in nature. Like, what does it mean to tap into like the dark aspect of the great mother? It's like, oh, that's destructive. She kind of just drains the life out of everything. She's going to come in like a hailstorm and destroy. But actually, it can be extremely powerful for us to tap into the shadow of that archetype, because maybe we lack aggression and power and assertiveness, especially through the feminine principle. So to me, it's not necessarily a sort of sublimation of the archetype, because to me, it's still almost like honoring what that aspect of the archetype is and sort of living it and embodying it, but also recognizing how that can go too far. So yeah, that's kind of what comes to mind initially about it, is like where are we influenced by these inherent ways of being, the archetypes, the sort of psychic structures of our being. And I don't always know if a sublimation fully is what's appropriate. At times it's actually just the full expression of it. But being able to also kind of take that dark aspect of the archetype and sort of morph it into a positive expression, I guess, is a form of sublimation, right? Like, I'm tapping into the dark mother, I'm embodying her, I'm Kali, and yet like I'm not actually going around destroying everything. I'm like going for that job that I want, you know, I am setting boundaries, and that kind of is a sublimation in and of itself. So anyways, hopefully that makes sense. And yeah, those are my thoughts.
Center Green, I don't know if this was intended to be a question for Q&A, but I'm not sure if that's supposed to be a name or not. But they brought up that is a country which has a polarized political system, is that collective shadow, and both parts projecting shadow onto the other. And I think that this just illustrates a good point, is that when we're talking about shadow at all scales, one person's light can be another person's shadow and vice versa, right? And that's why this gets kind of weird and tricky, is that two opposing political parties, that they're each other's shadows in a weird way. It's not just like, well, one party's the shadow and the other party's not. It's like, well, that's not really true. It's like they're shadows of each other. And so the shadow is kind of contextual in that sense, right? It can depend on the system. It can depend on the goal, right? If I have a certain goal in my life that might be different than my partner's goal, we might have different shadows of that goal, right? And it's who's to say which shadow is bad or good. It can be entirely sort of contextual. And the point I made about like having conversations with people, it's like, to me, my light is to be honest and speak the truth. And so I go around and speak the truth, and that's like my light. That's me bringing my shadow out and making it light. And to other people, speaking the truth might alienate them. And so like my light is their shadow, right? And so it's contextual. And what it's really getting into is like, what are the things that are welcome and not welcome. And it just depends on the system. It depends on the individual. It depends on the context. And that's why it can get so kind of complicated. But the political system for sure is a great illustration of shadow, and collective shadow, especially all the dynamics there. Manus, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Fantastic session so far, by the way. Feels like there's so much to get into. Yeah, so my question is really about the idea of shadow archetypes. I first came across the idea of this, which kind of blew me away as a possible, I don't know, way of approaching the shadow, I guess. And I wanted to hear your guys' take on this. You know, like some of the examples. Caroline Myers talks about the idea of, let's say, for example, the saboteur, you know, and the victim and the child and prostitute. And basically this idea that, you know, each of these archetypes, you know, there's this idea of a payoff, right? So the prostitute, for example, is the fact that, let's say, for example, I work at my job, you know, it pays well, it's practical, right? So I'm getting something out of it, but I'm not doing what I really care about. So I'm making a compromise, but the payoff is there's something practical I'm doing. I'm being financially responsible, right? The child might be an example of saying, you know, someone doesn't want to take responsibility, always wants to make someone else take the responsibility, right? And there's, I guess, various ways to approach these things. Just wanted to find out a little bit about, you know, what you guys think about, what your thoughts are on this idea of shadow archetypes and how that might help us do shadow work.
Some quick thoughts on that is that I think every archetype has a shadow and a light. So archetypes have valence, right? So like the Great Mother has a valence, and it can be kind of like a light valence. It can be like the good mother who is like nurturing and kind and loving, and Mother Nature and the goddess of the crops. It's like the good mother. And there can be sort of the terrible mother, which is, you know, abusive and tyrannical and is constantly trying to wreck your life. And that can be the same archetype falling into light, falling into shadow. So I think you can definitely identify shadow archetypes just in the sense that there are modes of being that, if they're in a balance in the golden mean, they are golden, right? They are light. But if they fall into excess or defect, they become shadow. So one example might be like the trickster archetype. And so like I have like a serious trickster archetype in me. I recognize that. I sort of dialogue with it. And I think it's virtuous. I think it's a light thing. Like I go around and I shake things up for people, and I do kind of goofy, like mischievous things. You see it in the chat sometimes, like the Stoa. And I think it's positive. It like kind of like changes the frame, makes things lighthearted. This trickster is good. It's like, it's fun. But the trickster can fall into shadow. I've said this before. If I get really drunk, I can become like a shadow trickster, and I just like will start to fuck with people in a way that like they don't think is funny. And I'm just like, it's like the trickster is like now going like, ha 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 ha. And like now I'm like setting things on fire and like just like burn. I want to see the world burn. It's like, you know, it becomes like the Joker, right? Like the shadow trickster. And so there's a valence to archetypes, and we can identify them, and we can identify them in ourselves, right? So there is a shadow trickster in me, and it comes out sometimes. And so I dialogue with it and be like, why do you come out? What is this about? Why are you not getting enough expression when you're sober, let's say? Or maybe there's like a shadow side of my hero archetype. I think I'm kind of a heroic person. I'm courageous. I take risks. I try to do things that other people are scared to do. But that can fall into shadow when it becomes like reckless, when it becomes stupid, when I take risks that are not called for at all. And so it's like the shadow hero, and that's something I need to identify and engage with, and find how to find that balance, bring it back into light, bring it back into that golden mean. So those are just some thoughts on that. Alyssa can maybe expand on that.
I think the only other thought was that some of these kind of archetypal titles that you put in the chat, like the saboteur or the prostitute, to me are like very culturally shadowy, to the point of like, you know, to embody like a saboteur or to embody a prostitute is something that all of us would feel is distasteful. It's our relationship to it collectively is an aspect that feels already in denial, and we have to recognize that the potential for those are inside of us. Like, is the prostitute someone who is in touch where their embodied sexuality, you know, is a sex worker who has chosen this lifestyle, and through that actually is trying to sort of shift the relationship and the kind of perception of what that means to be a saboteur? Is that because we see something that is inherently negative in a system and are trying to kind of be like a whistleblower? So these aspects sometimes fall into these like shadowy kind of collective realms, and it might be very difficult for us to approach that from both a personal and a collective layer. So it can be a very interesting sort of portal into shadow work if we feel sort of drawn to some of these elements and they already are an agreed upon shadow. So something else to sort of consider is that, you know, what have we agreed culturally, collectively, are things that are undesirable, distasteful, because that inherently creates a collective shadow imprint on us and then sort of moves through our personal psychology to impact us. And maybe that's something that needs to be reclaimed as well. Matt, you had a question. Did you want to ask that?
Sure. So my question was really what you see as the relationship between the individual shadow and the collective shadow, because it's clear that a lot of the leverage points that you have are at the individual level, and so when it comes to the collective shadow, there's a lot more open-ended question about what to do about it. So I guess my question is, do you see that having a how do I want to put it, like is there a direct tie between what a person does as far as their path of taking integration versus purging? Does that have effect at a collective level, or does it not really scale? Because I guess there would have to be, what I'm having a hard time articulating it, but I think it's like, I feel like it would have to have an almost like power law kind of effect for it to be useful at the collective level, or is it just the collective shadow is going to occasionally get totally out of control and there's not much that an individual can do about it? Hopefully that made some sense.
Yeah, totally. I think this question comes up a lot, honestly, just in thinking about like, what can I do like to help the world? Like what do I do? And you know, different people have different emphases on individual work is what you need to do. Like the individual is where it's at. Do the work. That's all you can do. Other people are like, no, it's a systemic thing. Like you need to like address the system. Like that's what's important. And like it's both, right? And those things are in a dance. And so part of the problem is if collectives are a collection of individuals, right? So individual shadow work is going to have an effect on the collective. Like that's a given. If you are healthy, the collective will be healthier. But the relational shadow has emergent properties. Like it's not just two individuals with shadows. It's like the relationship itself is an entity that has a shadow, and that needs to be addressed. And so two people in a relationship can both do shadow work, but that doesn't mean the relational shadow won't be there. There needs to be a new approach, and like emergent approach to the relational shadow that is different. And it's more complicated. And the collective level gets even more complicated. But if everyone in society just, you know, does yoga and meditates and writes in their journal every day, that's not going to fix everything. Like it's just like it's not that simple. There's problems that we are faced with that are like I said, emergent. Like it has to be addressed at a collective level as something that is different. The collective shadow is something that is different, and it needs to be approached differently. If everyone just does their shadow thing, what about climate change? Like, are we going to solve that if everyone's just doing their individual shadow work? It's like, no. So like there needs to be some sort of acknowledgement that there's a different perspective that needs to be taken, and a collective systemic approach. And what does that mean? It's a lot more complicated, but it's an eternal dance, right? Internal work, external work, personal work, systemic work. Those need to be always mutually reinforcing each other, and they do. If you do individual work, it helps the collective shadow. If you do systemic work, it helps the individual, right? So those are my thoughts.
I think one other point I want to add on is that at that individual level, when we don't take ownership of this type of shadow material, it often gets projected out into the external world, in the form of these storylines or narratives against other people, against other groups, other tribes, the kind of other, you might say. And that has this really like amplifying effect where it just grows upon itself. And so the continual denial of our own personal wounding that might not even have any sort of like sort of origin point in a systematic nature can still be put out and projected on to the system, you might say, or to another group or to another person. And the wounding and pain and trauma that we're dealing with internally can find its way into the collective in a way that I think cause these sort of like tides of cancellation or, scapegoating, things like that. So I agree with Arran that these things sort of feed into each other, that the systematic change can help individuals actually have the space or resources to turn towards their own trauma, towards their own shadow. That's sometimes a part of it, is like people are just barely keeping their head above water. How can they even address everything else that they're carrying with them? But that personal layer can be so extremely pivotal in making shifts and changes in the relationships that we see collectively and relationally, that it's actionable. You can do this. You can turn towards your own personal material in some capacity, whatever space you have in this time. And that can have this effect of really changing your relationship to the outer world and to others. So last few thoughts on that.
I think Chris had a question, but he left just now.
I think you should just answer it.
Okay, I will try and interpret it. I wasn't exactly sure what he meant, but I think, anyways, he says, can you clarify on the difficulty of expressing the real via the shadow? My sense is that in order to engage with someone's pain, I have to treat it as real. That is real in that it has power and impact on someone, and that it came from somewhere. So my interpretation is that in a therapeutic relationship, for instance, and that could be just a friendly therapeutic relationship, as in like Alyssa and I have a therapeutic relationship with each other where we're trying to help each other, let's say, you have to treat the other person's experiences and feelings as being real, right? They have to be valid, even if they seem outlandish. So if someone is seeing ghosts, for instance, if you're going to just say, well, that's ridiculous, there's no such thing as ghosts, that's stupid, that doesn't work very well. Again, that's kind of this purging dynamic, right? Like, I'm purging your feelings. They don't make sense, so I'm just going to destroy them. They need to be actually integrated, right? And so they need to be sort of accepted as being valid. Okay, you're seeing ghosts. Tell me about it. What is it like? What do these ghosts want? The same as something more mundane, like in a relationship, if someone just like, they're getting upset for something that's stupid. Like, maybe you drank the last of their milkshake and they're like really upset about that. You might think that like that's stupid, right? But if you try to approach it that way, it doesn't work very well. And you need to actually treat their experience, their subjectivity as real. You have to say, okay, I see that you are upset and your feelings are valid. And I recognize that you are feeling what you're feeling. And I don't understand why you're feeling what you're feeling, but I'm willing to sort of engage with it. So, I mean, I think that's basically what he's asking, is everyone's subjectivity in some sense is the real, right? Everyone's reality is real to them. And you can't really do shadow work very effectively if you pretend otherwise.
A slightly different interpretation. I feel like he was trying to hone in on the part where you were talking about being too like revealing with like this aspect of the shadow that I see about you is very real.
You mean like
And
keeping it real?
Yeah, keeping it real. You're keeping it too real.
That's a problem for me.
That is a problem. But how do we engage with that with people who might not be ready to face these aspects of the shadow? And when we consider it as real, even when we try to step out of our perception of it, you can see that sometimes these aspects are driving like really negative behavior where someone's just stuck in this behavioral pattern where they're just constantly rewounding themselves. And your ability to kind of be like, hey, like, do you want to kind of look at it this way? And they flip out on you. So maybe you have thoughts on that, because I think it's important to consider that the kind of dialectic can fail when the other person just can't hold that tension and complexity and overwhelming aspect of looking at their own shadow.
Wise words from a wise woman. All right, we are way past time and sounds like we're out of questions. So thank you everyone for showing up. This conversation has been really interesting. Next week is the final session, week 3, aspiring to shadow sense making. It's going to be interactive. We're going to workshop what shadow sense making might be in these online spaces, in these sort of emergent wisdom communities that are forming. So thank you so much for coming. Check out goldenshadow.org. If you want to follow our work, Cadell Last is here. He will be coming to the Golden Shadow on Sunday at 12 to talk about Freud versus Jung. I probably shouldn't be advertising on the Stoa, our own stuff, but I am anyways because Peter's not here. So come check out Cadell. He is brilliant. And yeah, that'll be on Sunday at 12 p.m. So go to goldenshadow.org if you want to RSVP to that. All right. Thanks, everyone. And see you next week, hopefully.